To be honest, I always believed that Waverly was the most predictable little town in all of Nebraska. A place where nothing truly changed, where time itself seemed reluctant to move forward. In the summer, the air carried the warm scent of cornfields. Cicadas hummed lazily in the trees, and the only sound breaking the quiet was the occasional truck rushing toward Lincoln. In winter, everything froze. The roads, the rooftops, even the rhythm of daily life. Residents could almost tell the time of day by the ringing of the Lutheran church bell on Main Street. Life flowed slowly, evenly, like a quiet stream that never shifted its course. But everything changed on a warm June evening in 1963, the moment Helen Brooks received the first letter. I knew Helen well enough. Everyone in Waverly did. She was the town librarian, soft-spoken, neat, and gentle, with eyes that always carried a hint of something unspoken. After her husband Tom Brooks died 2 years earlier in that accident on the I-80, she grew even quieter. It was as if grief had faded part of her soul, leaving behind only a delicate outline. I remember that crash. Everyone in town did. A car slipping off an embankment, fire spreading through the dry grass, sirens wailing too late. In a place like Waverly, tragedies never really disappear. They stay, lingering in people's memories like stains too deep to wash out. Helen continued her life in the same predictable rhythm. She arrived at the library precisely at 8 every morning, closed at 6, and often sat on her porch in the evenings, a book in hand she barely turned the pages of. It seemed as though she feared that raising her voice or moving too abruptly might break the fragile balance she'd built around herself. But the letter shattered it. It happened on an ordinary evening, the kind where the sun sinks slowly behind the fields and the entire town seems wrapped in a soft, sleepy stillness. Helen unlocked her front door, set her bag down, and noticed a white envelope waiting in her mailbox. No return address. No stamps. Just her name, written clearly, Helen Brooks. She later said she felt something tighten inside her, a sudden, inexplicable pull of fear. She opened the envelope right there at the door. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded in half, and on it was handwriting she recognized instantly. Her husband's handwriting. Tom's. The same Tom whose car had burned to its frame 2 years earlier. For a long moment she couldn't breathe. The world around her seemed to thicken, as if sound itself had been swallowed by the silence. Her eyes locked on the familiar, hurried strokes of the letters. Helen, don't be afraid. I can't come to you, but I can write. I don't have much time, and you need to know the truth. Salt Creek is not what people think it is. What happened to me was no accident. I'll explain more later. Tom. She read those words again, then again. Each time they struck deeper. She knew this handwriting, every angle, every rushed line. Tom always wrote as if he were in a race against time. It was him, but he was dead. Her initial fear gave way to anger. Who would dare to mock her grief like this? Why would anyone do such a thing? But the more she stared at the paper, the more the idea of a cruel prank became difficult to believe. The writing was too personal, too precise. She barely slept that night. The next morning, she brought the letter to the sheriff. John Murphy, a man with a heavy gaze and a slow, deliberate way of speaking, read it carefully before folding it again. Helen, he said gently, someone's messing with you. People can be cruel. Try not to take it too seriously. She nodded, but he could see she wasn't comforted. That handwriting, she whispered. You can't fake something like that? He promised he'd look into it, though she sensed he didn't believe her. Maybe he thought grief was finally becoming too heavy for her to carry. But on the third day, the second letter arrived, and things became far worse. This letter contained a memory, something impossibly intimate and personal. Do you remember the fall of '56? The trip to the lake? You lost your bracelet, and it was in your pocket the whole time. You laughed so loud, I thought we'd wake the entire shoreline. It was a moment known only to Helen and Tom. Then came a warning. Beware the people who go to the O'Hara farm, especially the one who brings milk there. That same morning, before Helen could reach the sheriff again, news spread through the town. Louis Morris, the milkman who serviced the O'Hara farm, had been found dead at dawn. A heart attack, the medics said. But Helen no longer believed in coincidences. That evening, when she returned home, she found something else unusual. Tom's old notebook, the one he used for planning his history lessons, lay open on the kitchen table. She hadn't touched it in years. She kept it stored in a box on the top shelf of her closet. And yet, here it was. On the last page, written in fresh pencil, were the words, Salt Creek, the beginning. Helen felt the ground shift beneath her. Someone had been in her house. Someone who knew her past. Someone who wanted her to follow the trail. She didn't sleep that night. She sat at the window, watching the silent street outside, sensing something old and hidden beginning to stir beneath the quiet surface of Waverly, something that had slept for decades. The letters were only the beginning. The next morning, she made her decision. She would go to Salt Creek, and that was where the real story began. I often wonder what truly pushed Helen to leave the house that morning. Fear? Anger? Or something deeper, something found in people who suffer silently for too long. A quiet, smoldering impulse, the desire to stop being a victim of circumstance. The morning was damp, the sky washed in a dull gray, and a heavy fog clung to the rooftops of Waverly. As summer approached, the fog grew thicker, almost alive in the way it breathed over the narrow streets. Helen walked along the sidewalk toward the library, keys in hand, but her thoughts were far away from books or work. She kept replaying the second letter, again and again, especially the unnerving lines. Beware the one who brings milk to the O'Hara's house. Now, after the sudden death of Louis Morris, the words from her husband, or whoever pretended to be him, felt disturbingly accurate. People in Waverly already knew about Morris's death by sunrise. Rumors traveled faster than wind, as always. And everyone said the same, predictable things. He had heart trouble. He was getting older. It was bound to happen. But no one mentioned that Louis was strong, energetic, and stubbornly healthy. He worked long days, hauling heavy milk cans across the county, barely taking breaks, never once complaining about fatigue or chest pain. His death felt too sudden, too clean, too convenient, and Helen could no longer pretend it didn't bother her. She tried to stay rational, tried to calm her breathing, but the unease only grew. Inside the library, she turned on the lamps and checked the catalog drawers. Everything appeared normal, everything precisely in its place. But her house, her quiet, empty house? How could someone break in without leaving a trace? And why leave Tom's notebook open on her table? Around 9, the library door opened, and a man stepped inside, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with a trimmed beard and attentive, tired eyes. It was Raymond Jensen, the mechanic whose shop stood near the highway. "Morning, Miss Brooks," he said gently. "You look a bit pale today. Everything all right?" Helen tried to answer with a polite librarian smile, but the words refused to come. "Ray, have you heard anything about the O'Haras?" He paused, frowning slightly. "The O'Haras? They mostly keep to themselves. Old Mr. O'Hara isn't one for neighbors. But," he lowered his voice, "people say someone visits them at night. A truck without plates. I've seen the headlights from the highway." A coldness slipped through Helen's spine. "When was this?" she asked quietly. "Couple weeks back. Maybe 3. Why?" She pressed her hands together, unsure what to say. If she told him the truth about the letters, about Tom's handwriting, about the ominous warnings, he might think she was losing her grip on reality. But still, something in Ray's expression felt safe. He'd always treated her with a sort of gentle caution, as though afraid to cause her more pain. "If something's wrong," he said quietly, "you can tell me, Helen. You know I'm around if you need anything." The silence between them lasted only a moment, but it carried weight, subtle, unspoken, fragile. A hint of romantic tension neither of them dared acknowledge. Helen was the one who looked away first. She still carried her husband's shadow with her. And now, with the letters, that shadow felt alive again. By noon, she made her decision. She tucked both letters into her bag and drove toward Salt Creek. The road wound through gentle hills covered in tall grass, the wind stirring them like waves upon a green ocean. The sky gradually cleared, the fog dispersing, replaced by a thin, pale summer light. Salt Creek had always felt peaceful, almost soothing. But that peace evaporated the moment she stepped out of the car. She parked near the wooden bridge and walked toward the water. The grass beneath her shoes was wet, though no rain had fallen for 2 days. The air felt unnaturally cold for June. She approached the creek's edge. The water was shallow, still, too still, as though it were holding its breath. Then she saw them, footprints in the damp sand, fresh footprints, boot prints, deep, heavy ones, leading from the creek toward the trees. Helen crouched down and touched the wet ground. Whoever made these tracks had been here only hours ago. Then she noticed a scrap of white paper caught on a low branch. It fluttered faintly, trembling in the soft breeze. She recognized the handwriting instantly. The same slanted letters, the same uneven strokes. A message. "You're closer than you think, but not alone. Someone is already watching." Helen spun around, heart pounding. The forest felt denser, the shadows deeper, as though the world had darkened without warning. The once gentle wind had turned suddenly frigid. She felt it then, an unmistakable sensation. Eyes on her, watching her from somewhere unseen. Not one pair of eyes, but several. The realization rooted her to the spot. Salt Creek wasn't just hiding a mystery. It was aware. It remembered. And now, it had turned its attention to her. To be honest, that day Helen felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. The unsettling sense that her fear was no longer entirely her own. It was as if the ground beneath her had begun paying attention, as if someone or something had finally noticed that she had come too close. She stood by the banks of Salt Creek, holding the torn slip of paper in her trembling fingers. The wind brushed through the tall grass, but even that natural sound felt wrong. Too even, too deliberate, as though the world around her were imitating nature rather than being it. A silence that followed felt heavy, like the moment before something inevitable happens. She lifted her head and looked around. The forest appeared ordinary at first glance. Dense oaks, slow elm shadows, the occasional chirp of birds, but something in the ordinariness felt disturbingly hollow. The birdsong looped too neatly, repeating the same pattern as though rehearsed. The air held a kind of stale stillness, one that pressed against her ribs with an unfamiliar weight. A single moment passed, and then Helen understood with startling clarity. She needed to leave. Right now. She was already turning back toward the path when a sharp crack broke the air behind her. She froze. It was the sound of a branch snapping, clean, deliberate, disturbingly close. She spun around quickly. There was nothing there. Only sunlight piercing through the leaves. Only a spiderweb swaying lazily between the branches. Only the surface of the creek, too calm, too smooth. Helen felt the tension climb up her spine like a cold hand. The sound could have been anything. A deer, a falling twig, her imagination, but every instinct in her recoiled. She didn't trust the silence anymore. She didn't trust the forest anymore. She didn't trust the creek. Something in the air whispered truth into her ear, even though no one spoke. You're not alone. She stepped backward, then another step, and then she was almost running. Her feet tangled in the tall grass. Her breath came out in short, uneven bursts. She didn't remember reaching her car or fumbling for the keys, yet moments later she was behind the wheel, slamming the door shut and starting the engine with shaking hands. As she turned onto the old dirt road, some of the pressure inside her chest eased, but the relief lasted only seconds. Up ahead, near the abandoned tractor shed, someone stood in the middle of the road. A man. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a faded work jumpsuit. His face was buried in shadow, not hidden exactly, simply unreadable, as though the light refused to touch it. He stood perfectly still, watching her car approach, not moving, not stepping aside, just standing and staring with a patience that chilled her more than any sudden movement would have. She didn't know him. She had never seen him before in Waverly. But something in the way he stood, rooted, expectant, filled her with the strange certainty that he knew her, knew exactly who she was and where she had been, knew why she was there. Helen's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. She didn't slow down. If anything, she pressed the gas harder. The car rolled past him, and she felt his eyes on her, even after she could no longer see him in the mirror. Only when the road curved and the shed disappeared behind the trees did her breath begin to steady again. The moment had passed, but something inside her had not returned to its place. That evening, back home, she locked her front door with both bolts and checked the windows twice. Normally, her house felt warm, safe, familiar. But tonight, even with the lamps lit, the rooms felt subtly altered, as though someone had been inside while she was gone. As though the air had been disturbed and then carefully put back. On the table lay the letters, the two earlier ones, and the torn fragment she had found near the creek. But something else drew her attention. Faint marks on the wooden surface. Thin lines, shallow but visible, as though someone had dragged a pencil or a nail across it. She sat down slowly, staring at the indentations, then at the letters again. She unfolded the newest one and read its fragmented message. You're closer than you think, but not alone. Someone is already watching. The strokes were pressed deeper, written with urgency, but the handwriting, painfully familiar, remained the same. She ran her fingers along each line, as though hoping the texture would reveal something the words did not. Her heart ached with recognition. It was still Tom's handwriting. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her breath. She had always been rational, practical, deliberate. She did not give in to superstition or hysteria. She believed in what could be proven. But nothing about this fit into what she understood to be real. If someone forged the letters, how did they know such intimate details? If someone had been watching her, for how long? If her husband was trying to warn her, how? The thought dissolved before she could finish it. The sudden ring of the telephone shattered the silence. One sharp chime. Helen flinched, every muscle tightening. She approached the phone slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. She lifted the receiver. "Hello?" she whispered. No answer. Only breathing. Uneven, ragged, disturbingly close. Her skin prickled. "Who is this?" she asked, barely audible. But there was no reply. Only silence. Then a soft click, and the line went dead. Helen lowered the receiver with trembling fingers. For the first time since the letters began, she understood something with piercing clarity. Whatever Salt Creek was hiding had already crossed her threshold, and escaping it would be far more difficult than entering it. After that phone call, Helen stood in the kitchen for a long time without moving. It felt as if the air in the room had become heavier, thicker, as if something else had settled in the house, alongside the silence and her own thoughts. She walked slowly to the window and looked outside. Twilight had already fallen over Waverly, that soft violet glow that appears only in Nebraska summers. The neighbors' houses looked ordinary again. The streetlights had turned on, and Mr. Langley's two huskies, or chasing fireflies on the lawn. But the sensation of being watched didn't go away. Helen pulled the curtains shut. Then she checked whether all the doors were locked. Then, just in case, she checked again. She knew this night would be different. Too much had happened already to dismiss it as coincidence or nervous imagination. And yet, when the clock struck 9, she forced herself to change into her nightclothes and sit on her bed with a book, as she did most evenings. Part of her tried to cling to the routine, as if the familiar rhythm of normal life could shield her from whatever was approaching. But she couldn't read. The words blurred together, becoming part of the same low hum echoing in the back of her mind. After half an hour, Helen closed the book and stepped into the hallway. And only then did she notice something that made her heart thump harder. The hallway light was flickering. Weak, uneven flashes. She clearly remembered that it was steady earlier. She took a step forward, and then she heard it. A click. Somewhere in the house, a door closed softly. Helen froze. A cold realization washed over her, not from the air, but from understanding. Someone was inside. She slowly turned her head toward the sound. Every shadow looked alive. Every line of the wall looked suspiciously unfamiliar. "Who's there?" she whispered. No answer, but from deeper in the hallway came a faint creak of the floorboards, as if someone quietly shifted their weight from one foot to the other. Helen reached for the switch, her fingers trembling. She turned on the light, and the hallway was empty. Completely empty. She walked farther, checking room after room. The kitchen, the living room, the spare bedroom, nothing. But when she returned to the hallway, she saw something. On the floor, near the wall, lay a small strip of torn paper, as if someone had ripped it from a notebook. She picked it up. There was a pencil mark on it, not a word, not a letter, just a line, pressed deep as if the person writing it had been shaken. And Helen instantly recognized where it came from Tom's teacher's notebook, the one she had found on the kitchen table. Someone had touched it again. Helen pressed the strip to her chest and closed her eyes. This wasn't a hallucination, not a dream. Someone had been coming into the house while she was away, or while she was inside. She remembered the man by the shed, how still he stood, how he watched, as if he were waiting. Could it have been him? She didn't know, but that no longer mattered. A quiet, steady voice rose inside her, stronger than before. She couldn't leave. She couldn't give up. If Tom had been trying to tell her something, if all this was truly connected to Salt Creek, then she had to continue. Helen went to the desk and placed the torn strip beside the other letters. The arrangement looked almost ritualistic. White sheets, handwriting lines, the objects she had found by the river, and now this new small clue. She sat, folding her arms on the table. She stared at everything for a long time, trying to assemble the picture. And then she realized something she had missed earlier. All 3 letters and the new strip weren't just written by Tom. They were written at different times, with different pressure, different rhythm, as if the person writing them was changing. Helen stood and walked to the window. Night had fully settled, and something definitely breathed near her house. She couldn't see it, but she felt it. A faint presence, stubborn, patient. It was waiting. She inhaled deeply, closed the curtains, and whispered, "All right, if this is what you want, I'll keep going." And in that moment, outside the window, something gently crackled. Helen slowly turned, and for the first time in days, she understood. She wasn't just reading letters anymore. She was already inside the story, and there was no way back. Helen hadn't slept for most of the night. She sat in the armchair by the window, listening to every rustle, every faint movement outside the house. Sometimes she thought the bushes beneath her window swayed, not from the wind, but as if someone slowly passed by. And other times she imagined she heard a faint creak behind the wall, like an extra step had appeared in the house that did not belong to her. With the first dim traces of dawn, Helen understood. Staying in this fog of uncertainty meant allowing fear to grow. And if someone or something wanted her to learn the truth, she would, but not from the shadows. She had to do something she had avoided for 2 years. Visit the place where Tom died. The stretch of I-80, where the accident happened, was only 20 minutes away, but she had never gone there. She couldn't. She only saw the road from afar and turned away immediately. Now everything was different. She dressed, tied her hair back, took a deep breath, and stepped outside. The sunlight was soft, warm, almost comforting. But inside her, the sense of someone else's presence still vibrated, as if someone stood behind her, watching, not touching. She got in the car and pulled onto the road. The morning air was clear, and the field stretched along the highway green, calm, as if no secrets or fear existed at all. But the closer she approached that place, the tighter her chest felt, as if an invisible hand were slowly closing around her heart. There were no traces of the crash anymore, just a guardrail and a small concrete pull-off. But the moment Helen parked, she felt a sudden chill. Even the air changed heavier, denser. She stepped out and walked to the edge. Here it happened. Here her life had split into before and after. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine that day, the sirens, the flames, the voices of strangers. But then, as if coming from a buried layer of reality, a sound echoed. A light metallic click. She opened her eyes sharply. The road was empty, silent. But near the guardrail, something lay on the ground. She walked closer. A small charred metal rivet, barely noticeable, but it rested so deliberately on the concrete that it looked placed. She picked it up, and suddenly she heard a whisper, not outside. Inside her, a single word, stop. Helen jerked her hand back and looked around. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears. Who said that? The voice wasn't hers. But she recognized it. Tom. It didn't feel like a memory. It came now. She slipped the rivet into her pocket, then noticed something else. Footprints, old, blurred, but still visible, leading from the guardrail down toward a narrow path swallowed by plants. A path that didn't exist before. Helen crouched and touched the ground. The dust was grainy, but the deep impressions remained, as if the person who walked there moved unsteadily, or in a hurry, maybe leaving the site of the accident. She stood and looked into the path. Beyond the first line of trees stretched a ravine, and that was where she felt it strongest. Cold, pressure, a foreign awareness. She stepped forward, then another step. She was almost ready to walk deeper when suddenly, behind her, something clicked. Helen turned. A car stood on the road, dark, dusty, its wheels coated in dried mud. A man sat inside, his face hidden by the shadow of the visor. He didn't approach. He simply watched her, too long, too motionless. Then he lowered the window slightly and smiled, but the smile was wrong. Not human. Too stretched, as if it didn't belong to his face. Helen stepped back. The car slowly rolled forward and drove off, soundless, smooth, as if gliding rather than driving. Only when the shape disappeared around the bend did she finally exhale. She turned back to the path. If the truth is here, she whispered softly, I'll find it. And she stepped into the brush following the tracks, toward whatever began her husband's death, and whatever still followed her now. Helen walked along the narrow path, disappearing into dense undergrowth, a path that felt less like something created by people, and more like something carved out by necessity. The silence surrounding her wasn't the natural kind. It was the sort that felt held, as if someone had pressed a finger to the lips of the forest. The air hung thick and humid, and sunlight barely slipped through the tangled branches above. Every step echoed inside her chest. She wasn't entirely sure what she was searching for, but the sense that answers were close pressed behind her eyes like a physical weight. At times she thought the trees shifted slightly, even though there was no wind at all. Leaves trembled as if someone had brushed past them a moment before she turned. She stopped. She thought she heard footsteps behind her. She spun around, nothing. Just the path, wet soil, and a thin veil of fog that seemed to thicken unnaturally, as though the forest itself was exhaling around her. Helen continued forward. The path dipped toward a shallow ravine. The deeper she went, the stranger her sense of time became. The forest didn't just hide something. It remembered something. After a minute, she reached a small clearing. The ground was pressed down, as if someone had stood here often, or fallen here. She moved closer. At first, she thought she was looking at a knot of roots. But when she knelt down, she froze. It was a piece of metal, a thin tubular frame, burned and snapped in half. Something from a vehicle. Maybe even from the vehicle. She touched it. It was cold. Too cold, as if it had been lying not in a humid forest, but in a freezer. And then the whisper returned. Clearer this time. Closer. Right behind her ear. "Don't touch." Helen jolted and twisted around. No one. She backed away, pulse pounding. Then she noticed footprints in the dirt. Deep, uneven, like someone had been struggling to stay upright. The prints led away from the clearing, toward an even narrower trail. One footprint was stained with something dark. At first, she thought it was mud. It wasn't. Blood. Old, nearly black. She swallowed hard. What had happened here? And why had no one found this place? She followed the prints. The trees seemed to close around her, leaning inward as if watching. The air grew colder. Goosebumps crawled up her arms. Then, a glint. She quickened her pace and saw fabric. A piece of blue jacket caught on a branch. The same color as the work uniforms of the road maintenance crews. The ones who were on shift the day of the crash. She reached toward it, and then a sharp crack echoed behind her. She froze. Someone had stepped on a branch. She turned slowly, and she saw him. The man from the highway, now standing between the trees. Head slightly tilted, studying her. Unblinking. His jacket was smeared with dirt, and dry blood darkened the sleeve. But his face felt wrong. Empty. Too still, like someone living on instinct rather than emotion. "You were following me?" Helen forced out. No response. He stepped toward her. His movement twitched slightly. Unnatural, almost mechanical, as if he wasn't fully in control of his own limbs. Helen backed away. "Who are you?" she asked again. The man raised his hand. Fresh scrapes covered his fingers. Bits of bark clung beneath his nails, as though he had just climbed out of the ravine. Then, slowly, he gestured for her to follow. Helen didn't move at first. Every instinct screamed to run. But if he knew what happened that night, she stepped forward. He turned and began walking deeper into the forest. With each step he took, a faint scent grew stronger in the air. The same one she smelled near the old crash site. Smoke. Burned rubber. Something metallic and sharp. Her heartbeat thudded painfully. He was leading her to the real place. Not the one the rescue teams had seen. The one the forest had hidden. Helen followed him. And for the first time, she felt she was dangerously close to the truth. Too close. Helen followed the man through the forest, trying to keep her breathing steady. He moved strangely, too quickly at times, too slowly at others. But he never looked back at her, not even once. She didn't want to follow him, yet going back alone felt even worse. Something about the forest behind her felt wrong, as if the path she had come from was quietly disappearing. The man's steps were uneven. Twice he stopped abruptly and tilted his head. listening in a way that reminded her of an animal sensing danger. His behavior made her skin crawl, but she forced herself to keep moving. "Where are you taking me?" she asked. He gave no response. He simply lifted his hand and pointed deeper into the woods. The forest changed as they walked. The trees grew thinner, younger, the air colder. A sharp metallic scent began to mix with the smell of damp earth. The further they went, the more the temperature seemed to drop. Helen rubbed her hands together, but the chill kept creeping up her arms. Finally, they reached a narrow ravine. The canopy above was so dense that almost no light reached the ground. The man stepped aside and gestured downward. Helen walked to the edge and looked. Scattered across the bottom of the ravine were metal fragments, twisted, burned, torn apart as if someone had ripped a car into pieces. A faint trembling passed through her legs as she began to descend. The silence around her was unnatural. No birds, no wind, nothing but her own breathing. When she reached the debris, she froze. It wasn't just any metal. They were pieces of her husband's car, the same car that, according to the official report, had burned completely on the interstate. But these fragments weren't burned. They were crushed and folded, violently torn inward. No fire had done this. Helen touched a piece of metal. It was shockingly cold. She pulled her hand back as though burned, though the temperature was the complete opposite. "This isn't possible," she whispered. Behind her, the man inhaled deeply, the sound strange and uneven. Helen turned to face him. His posture was different now, as if he no longer remembered how to hold his own body. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. His eyes twitched, struggling to focus on her. Did you see the accident?" she asked. The man stepped toward her, too quickly, too close. Helen stumbled back. He stopped only when she moved away, as if studying the distance she kept between them. Then he lifted his hand. Blood stained his fingers. Dried, dark, unmistakably real. Helen's breath caught. She didn't know if it was her husband's blood, but the thought alone made her legs tremble. "What are you trying to show me?" she whispered. The man turned abruptly and moved to a corner of the ravine. Something dark was half buried under stones. He reached down, pulled it out, and tossed it toward her. Helen knelt and picked it up. A jacket, Tom's jacket, the one he wore constantly during the last weeks of his life. Her chest tightened. The forest seemed to press in on her from all sides. The man pointed upward now, toward the cliff above them. Helen lifted her eyes. Footprints, fresh footprints in the damp earth, leading from the top of the ravine down to the pile of wreckage. Boot prints, large, deep, and they didn't match the man standing beside her. Someone else had been here, recently. Someone who had dragged the remains of the car here. Someone who knew she would eventually come. Helen stepped back, clutching the jacket. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. The man beside her trembled. His entire body seemed to tense, as if he were hearing something she couldn't. Then, with a sudden jolt, he froze in place. His expression twisted, not with fear, but with some internal command he couldn't resist. Before she could speak, he turned sharply and ran, not like a person, like something that had been frightened into instinct. Helen remained alone in the ravine. She looked around, the metal fragments, the unnatural cold, the silence pressing in. She thought of the official report, the way the sheriff refused to answer her questions, the way everyone in Waverly avoided talking about the night of the accident. She pressed Tom's jacket to her chest. Whatever happened to her husband didn't happen on the road, and it didn't happen the way they claimed. Someone in Waverly knows the truth. Someone has been hiding it, and Helen was now certain. She had just stepped into something far more dangerous than she had imagined. Helen stood at the threshold of her home, unable to feel her fingers. The door was open just enough for someone to slip inside without making a sound. She didn't remember leaving it that way. She would never have left without checking the lock twice, or 3 times, as she'd been doing lately. She stepped forward. The wooden floor creaked under her foot, too softly, as if the sound itself had been pressed down by something unseen. Helen held her breath and listened. Silence, but it wasn't the kind of silence that meant safety. It was the kind that pressed in on her, thick and suffocating, as though the walls were hiding something. She slowly closed the door behind her, not wanting anyone outside to see what was happening inside. A strip of pale daylight from the window stretched across the floor, and it felt like the only safe place in the entire house. Helen crossed the hallway, trying not to look at anything too long, but her eyes kept catching on details. A chair angled differently, a book resting on the edge of the table, though she remembered putting it away. The kitchen curtain slightly shifted. Small things, almost invisible on their own, yet unmistakable when gathered together. She approached the table. Tom's notebook lay on top. Helen remembered putting it inside the drawer last night. Now it was open, flipped to a page where Tom had once written something about his work at the mill. But across his handwriting, new lines had been scribbled. Not his. The ink was dry, but she couldn't tell if it had been written years ago or only minutes earlier. The phrase read, "D-O-N-T, look at the window." Helen stopped breathing. Her eyes twitched toward the side window, but she forced herself not to look. If the warning was meant for her, then looking might be the exact thing she wasn't supposed to do. She stepped back carefully. Then she heard it, a sound from outside, from the side of the house where the window stood. Someone was there, standing directly beneath it, listening. Helen's hands curled into fists. The silence grew heavier, as though the entire house were waiting alongside her, sharing the same breathless tension. She knew she needed help. The phone was in the living room. If she could reach it quietly, she took a step. And at that moment, the hallway phone emitted a sharp electronic beep. Not a ring, a message alert. Helen turned, feeling cold rush down her spine. The phone's red light blinked steadily. A voicemail. She lifted the receiver carefully, angling it so the speaker wouldn't echo through the room. She pressed the playback button. For a moment, she heard nothing but faint static, then breathing, uneven, strained, like someone trapped in a tight space, or underground. Then a voice, a whisper, dry, shaky, painfully forced. "He's close. Don't move." Helen dropped the receiver, not because of the fear, but because she recognized the voice. It was male, weak, barely holding together, and unmistakably familiar. It sounded like Tom. Helen was driving toward Mark Merrow's house, though she didn't fully understand what exactly she expected to find there. After speaking with Murphy, she was left with a strange sensation, as if every word he said hid another meaning beneath it, another layer he didn't want to reveal or was afraid to. But the most important thing was something else. For the first time, she felt Tom might have been right. That something truly was happening in Salt Creek, something people preferred not to speak about. The road to Mark's place cut through old fields, long abandoned, yet still holding traces of past life. Strips of dry grass, scattered remnants of fences, faded posts with numbers that could no longer be read. The wind moved across the plain in an unnaturally even way, as if someone had lowered the volume of nature. Helen turned toward the house, small, tidy, with a leaning shed to the side. She expected to see Mark in the yard, as usual, but he wasn't there. Instead, there was a kind of silence that felt too dense, as if the air itself was listening to her steps. She stepped onto the porch and knocked. No answer. She knocked again, louder, still silence. But now it felt heavier, tense. She tried the handle. The door was unlocked. That was strange. Mark always locked his doors. The house greeted her with a smell of dust and something else, metallic, faint, but concerning. There were marks on the floor, as if someone had been pacing back and forth, shifting weight from heel to toe like in hesitation. Helen called out, "Mark, are you home?" Silence replied. Not ordinary silence, but silence hiding something. She walked into the living room. Folders, papers, pens, everything lay arranged as if Mark had just been working there, only stepped away for a moment. Except, this didn't feel like a moment. There was a mug on the table, coffee inside, cold, very cold. Helen spotted something near the chair, a thin glass ampule, empty. She picked it up and noticed a faint chemical scent, sharp, the kind she smelled only in labs when she accompanied Tom during his research. As if someone tried to leave evidence, but did it too neatly. She continued down the hallway. Another ampule lay there, and another, right beside the door to the basement. She stopped. The basement door was slightly open. Helen didn't know what scared her more, going down or staying upstairs. But something inside her had already decided, something cold and firm, like the feeling Tom used to have when he told her, sometimes the only path forward is the one that scares you this most. Helen slowly took the flashlight hanging on a hook near the wall. Her fingers trembled, not from cold. She stepped toward the door and pushed it gently. The wood creaked, long, unwilling, protesting. Cold air drifted up from the basement. Real cold, deep, damp, the kind that doesn't belong in normal homes. And the smell, the same metallic scent, only stronger now. Helen turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, but revealed only the first few steps. She took a step, then another. Halfway down the third step, she froze, because something below clicked softly, like someone brushing against glass, or taking a step. "Mark," she whispered. No answer, but the silence now had breath, and it wasn't her own. Morning in Waverly began quieter than usual, as if the town had decided to hold its breath. Thick fog lay over the streets, so densely that the houses looked like blurred silhouettes. Helen was walking to the library, though she knew she wouldn't be able to work today. But going somewhere was easier than staying at home, where every shadow reminded her of yesterday's phone call. She stopped at the library door, inserted the key, and froze. On the floor, tucked neatly under the threshold, lay a white envelope. Another letter. Helen looked around. The street was empty, only the fog sliding across the asphalt. She slowly picked up the envelope. Her name was on it. The same handwriting, even, rushed, Tom. Her breathing grew heavier. She didn't open the letter right away. Instead, she walked into the library, closed the door behind her, and leaned against it as if trying to hold back some invisible pressure growing outside. Only after several long breaths did she tear the envelope open. Inside was a single sheet, and only 3 lines. "They know what you're looking for. Don't go there alone. Someone will come today." Helen felt a cold shiver run down her arms. The questions were multiplying, and there were no answers at all. She no longer tried to convince herself this was someone's prank. Too many coincidences. Too many warnings that came true. She hid the letter in her pocket and began arranging books just to keep her hands busy. But a few minutes later, she suddenly froze, listened. The library was silent, so silent that even the sound of her breathing seemed too loud. And then, a quiet click. Someone had entered. Helen turned around. A man stood in the doorway, middle-aged, wearing a work jacket, his face tired, his eyes wary. She recognized him, Harold Finch, the local mechanic, a calm, withdrawn man who rarely visited the library. "Miss Brooks?" His voice sounded muted. "We need to talk." Helen slowly stepped closer. "Is this because of Tom?" Harold was silent for a long moment, then nodded. "You weren't supposed to receive those letters, and you certainly weren't supposed to open them." Helen felt a wave of anger rising in her chest. Who's writing them? Do you know? Harold stepped back, nervously glancing at the door, as if making sure no one had followed him. I don't know who writes them, he said, but I know who wants you to stop searching. And I know what happened out there, at O'Haru. Helen moved closer. Then tell me. Harold ran a hand over his face, as though gathering his strength. Last night, I saw a man near your house. The same one who stands by the old shed at Salt Creek. Tall, in overalls. Helen felt ice spreading through her. Are you sure? Yes, he whispered. He's watching you. And if you think this is all about the letters, it's not. It started much earlier, even before your husband died. Harold, she exhaled, say it plainly. Tom, he didn't die the way they said, did he? The mechanic looked away. He uncovered something old, something he shouldn't have touched. And now you're following his trail. What exactly? Helen's voice broke. I can't say it here, he replied sharply. The walls have ears. He stepped toward the exit. Tonight, after sunset, at the mill. I'll tell you everything. Harold opened the door. But before leaving, he said, and for God's sake, Miss Brooks, don't go there alone. The door closed. The library sank back into silence. Helen stood there, clutching the letter to her chest. Someone will come today. And that someone had already come. Helen stepped into the fog, as though crossing a threshold into another world. One where the air felt too dense, too silent, too aware of her presence. The door of the library shut behind her with a muted thud. For a moment, she simply stood there, listening to her own breath, listening to the brittle crunch of gravel beneath her boots, listening to the strange stillness of Waverly, a stillness so complete it felt intentional, like the whole town was holding its breath for her. She tightened her grip on the flashlight. Harold's warning echoed in her thoughts. He's watching you. Don't go there alone. The streetlights cast pale halos that hovered in the fog, struggling to push through more than a short radius. As she moved forward, each step felt like sinking deeper into something unseen, something waiting. She reached the intersection where Julian claimed to have seen the hooded figure. There were no footprints on the wet pavement, no lingering outlines, no shadows where they should have been. But she felt watched, not imagined, not a trick of nerves. A presence patient, quiet, evaluating her with a kind of cold intelligence. Helen swallowed hard and turned onto the old road leading out of town. The mill lay to the east, past Silt Creek, past the abandoned rail spur, past the stretch of land Tom once jokingly called the dead stretch. He used to laugh when he said it. She used to laugh with him. Now she wished she'd never remembered that phrase at all. The fog thickened as she left the last houses behind. They vanished into white, the way ships disappear into deep ocean, swallowed completely. The world narrowed to a dim corridor around her, defined only by the beam of her flashlight. 5 minutes later, she stopped abruptly. Someone was walking behind her. Slow steps, measured, unhurried, not even attempting to hide. She didn't turn immediately. She forced herself to breathe once, then again, steadying her hands, before spinning sharply to face the road behind her. It was empty. Fog drifted and curled over the asphalt like living smoke. Helen lifted the flashlight higher, slicing through the gray. Nothing. No person. No movement. No sound. But her pulse hammered so loudly, it almost drowned out her breathing. She forced herself forward again. The town faded away behind her. Ahead, the silhouette of the old mill rose against the faint evening glow like a broken spine. Even in daylight, the structure always looked unnatural, bent metal, rusted walls, the sagging roof hanging like a jaw, about to unhinge. At dusk, wrapped in fog, the mill looked like something that shouldn't exist at all. Helen slowed her steps. A figure stood near the entrance. Not Harold. She knew that immediately. Tall, too tall, hunched forward slightly, as though the person inside the clothing didn't quite fit the shape of their own body. Dark clothing, shapeless, something like a work coverall. Her breath caught sharply. Julian hadn't imagined him. She forced herself to speak, though her throat felt tight. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure didn't move. Not a twitch, not a tilt of the head. Just standing there, watching. Fog drifted around him, but he didn't react. He didn't shift his weight. He didn't breathe, not visibly. Helen stepped back. The figure stepped forward. A jolt of fear twisted through her stomach. She raised the flashlight higher, her hand trembling. "Stay back," she said. "I'm not here alone." It was a lie, but it was all she had. The figure stopped. For long seconds, they stared at each other, though she couldn't see a face beneath the hood. The darkness inside, it looked too deep to be natural, like a void. Then the mill door behind him opened slightly. Helen flinched. The figure turned, slowly, deliberately, as though controlled by some unseen mechanism. He slipped inside without a sound. The heavy door swung shut behind him, leaving her alone, or as close to alone as one could be when something was watching from the dark. Helen stood frozen, gripping the flashlight until her knuckles whitened. Fear urged her to turn around, to run, to forget everything. Memory whispered back, "Tom died for this." She stepped toward the mill. One step, then another. She reached the door and laid her hand on the cold, rusted metal. She pushed it open and stepped into the dark. The darkness inside the mill was different from the darkness outside. If the fog concealed, then here the night consumed. Helen took a step, and the echo of her footsteps rolled through the vast empty space, like through the hollow insides of an abandoned beast. She lifted her flashlight. The beam of light trembled. The smell of dampness mixed with the smell of rust, and she inhaled. Yes, and something else. Something that reminded her of rotting wood. The wind pushed one of the warped beams, and the mill let out a long creak. Helen swallowed and forced herself to move forward. Something metallic glinted to her right. She turned the flashlight sharply and exhaled in relief. Just an old cable spool. But after 2 more steps, she saw the tracks. On the dust covering the concrete floor, a trail of large footprints stood out clearly. Those footprints, belonging to someone taller than a normal person. Helen crouched and touched the dust with her fingers. The track was fresh, very fresh. She straightened up, and at that moment, something clicked high above, near the ceiling. Not a lamp, not metal, a camera, or a shutter. Helen snapped her flashlight upward. Nothing, only beams, rust, and darkness. "Harold?" she whispered. "Are you here?" Silence. She walked on, moving deeper into the dark corridor that led to the mill's back rooms. Every step sent cold ripples through her chest. Her gaze caught on an old metal cabinet. The door was slightly ajar. "Please," she whispered, not knowing to whom she was speaking. "Just don't let it be." She yanked the door open. Empty. The shelves were rusted, flakes of paint falling to the floor. But on the inside of the door a clear handprint. Large, as if someone had gripped the metal. Fresh. Helen recoiled. She quickened her pace. She needed to find Harold. Now, the corridor led her into a huge room filled with old machinery. Some of it was nearly intact, others twisted as if bent by immense force. It was colder here, much colder. And as she stepped inside, the air seemed to thicken and grow heavier. "Harold?" She called, louder. Something clinked in the depths of the hall. She raised her flashlight, sweeping the beam between abandoned structures. And she saw him. Harold was lying on the concrete floor, slumped against the wall. Eyes closed, blood on his temples, his shirt torn. He was paler than any living person should be. Oh God, she gasped. Harold, she dashed to him, falling to her knees. Harold, can you hear me? Harold! He twitched, forcing his eyes open. He saw her, tried to rise, but couldn't. You shouldn't have come, he whispered. Who did this? That man? Harold gave a faint nod. He isn't alone. Helen's breath caught. What do you mean? Who are they? Harold, what did Tom find? He grabbed her hand, as if it was the only thing keeping him in this world. Not here. The walls. They listen. He coughed blood. They are beneath the ground. Everything is down there. A deep thud shook the floor. A tremor. Dust drifted down from the beams. Harold froze, eyes widening. He's coming. Helen lifted her head. And at the far end of the hall, in the dense darkness, a figure slowly, far too slowly, began to take shape. That figure, too tall, too still, too inhuman in its silence. He stood and watched, and neither fog nor darkness nor distance could hide the truth. He had come for her.